I am going to introduce one Kevin Vincent. Let me bring up his information. Here it is. I wanted to tell you that this gentleman has been with the Ball Sellers House longer than I have. You might know that I run the Ball Sellers House, and he has been a docent with it for longer than I've been associated with the Arlington Historical Society. So it should come as no surprise that 18th century Arlington is his pièce de résistance. Really, thinking of Lafayette.
My specialty.
There you go. So you should know that historic preservation is a hobby and a passion of Kevin's. He's pursued it for decades. He has served on the board of the National Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route Association, because who traveled through Arlington? Rochambeau. He was a member of the Arlington County Historical Affairs Landmark Review Board, that's the HALRB, for 15 years, and he was 3 years as its chairman. So he knows Arlington history as well as 18th century Arlington history. He's a member of the Historical Society, no surprise there. And he serves on the committee that manages the Ball Sellers House. You may know that he leads a tour of the George Washington's property in Arlington, and he does that in the spring when it's a lot cooler, and you can catch that every year. It's called George Washington's Forest Walking History Tour. So, Kevin, I am going to let you remind us what speaking in the 18th century was really like.
Thank you, Matt, for the introduction. I do have the advantage of microphones, which they didn't have in the 18th century, which is really important because I do not have a good voice for public speaking, but hopefully you can hear me okay with the microphones. If I step away or I'm sounding bad, somebody tell me. Dan, do I sound okay? Okay, all right, good. So I'm going to walk you through my PowerPoint and tell you what I'm looking at on my screen, and then explain to you what's going on 250 years ago here in Arlington, which is really the focus of what I want to get to tonight. We'll talk about Arlington's role in the American Revolution writ large, but with a special focus on this week, 250 years ago. So let's first of all start with my first slide. I've got a really nice 18th century map of Arlington. And the first thing you notice in the 18th century map of Arlington, there is no Arlington. So we are, it's simply part of Fairfax County. Arlington County didn't get created until, well, the county didn't get created until well into the 19th century, but the boundaries only created with the creation of the District of Columbia in 1791. So we are not differentiated from the rest of Fairfax County, except for we were just immediately north of the town of Alexandria. And frankly, Alexandria wasn't differentiated from Fairfax County either. In the 18th century, you didn't have a separate city of Alexandria like today. It's separate from Fairfax and Arlington County. It was all one jurisdiction. So our history is really Alexandria's history in the 18th century. It is rural Fairfax County's history. That's Arlington County's history. But we try to dig in. What I tried to do a little bit with this presentation is focus on the folks who were actually here within the boundaries of Arlington and what they were doing in the Revolution, because there was a lot going on here. So Arlington County, as I said, was not a county, and it was completely rural. So there was no industry to speak of at all in Arlington. Everybody was a farmer. Tobacco or corn or wheat. Tobacco is already playing out at that point, so a lot of corn and wheat farmers. And that's what everybody did. The only industry you could speak of is the mouth of Pemmott Run, believe it or not, was the only industrial area of Arlington County. You had some warehouses there. The boats used to go all the way up to the mouth of Pemmott Run, right where Chain Bridge is today. And the Lee family actually owned some warehouses at that location. There were some mills there. And then on 4 Mile Run, about where Shirlington is today, John Carlyle and some others had some mills. So of course the mills were just supporting the agricultural economy, the wheat anyway. So that was it. Everybody else was growing crops. And you had in Arlington, so my third slide, the Historical Society has a great map of 1760 where all the landowners are marked with the names of the landowners and the boundaries. And you can see wherever your neighborhood is, you can see who owned it in 1760, and there are some tenants listed as well. So in Arlington County, you had a few small landowners. You had a few tenants. They weren't landowners, but they were tenants on larger landowners. And you had one in particular large landowner who lived within boundaries of modern day Arlington County. And then you had several landowners who lived nearby but owned property within Arlington. And some of those big landowners who have a very real Arlington connection had extremely significant roles in the Revolution, which we'll talk about. So in Arlington at that time, there were some names that we're all familiar with because they left a lasting legacy here in Arlington. There were Balls, Ballston, all the different Ball families over the years their ancestors were already here in Arlington. I live in Donaldson Run neighborhood. The Donaldsons were here at that time. So the Alexanders who have actually moved on had a very prominent role at that point, and they left their name for the city of Alexandria. You actually had some Lees who had property. They owned warehouses up in mouth of Pemmon Run, and the Lees were owning property here within Arlington before Robert E. Lee came in the 19th century. You already had Lees here from Richard Henry Lee's family. And then you had George Mason was here. George Mason didn't live here, but he already owned a big chunk of Arlington County. So his permanent legacy with George Mason University, it started with not just a name, but with an actual connection to us. So what was going on exactly 250 years ago? You were coming up in the lead up to the American Revolution, but there's also just normal life going on. George Washington is buying property here in Arlington County. He had a good friend who was essentially acting as his real estate agent and connected with him with a seller who wanted to sell some property for timber properties, several hundred acres, 1,200 acres or so in now Arlington and Fairfax County. And George Washington had the initial discussions with the Mercer family, George and James Mercer, who had pretty interesting connection to the Revolution. That George Mercer was the Stamp Act agent for the Commonwealth of Virginia, got run out of the colony in the lead up to the Revolution, and ended up being a loyalist stayed in England throughout the Revolution. And his brother James was a very devoted patriot, became a member of the Continental Congress, and served in the Congress after the Revolution as well, was a committed patriot. But those two brothers, one a loyalist, one a patriot, owned land here, 1,200 acres in what's now Arlington County. And George Washington was interested in buying it. Just a couple months earlier, back in April, I think, Washington actually rode through the property. He was on his way somewhere else and actually checked out his property on his way, the property he was looking at buying. And before the end of the year, George Washington would make an offer and agree to buy the purchase of the land that he would own in what's now Arlington County. The walk I do every year on Washington's Forest. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of Washington's acquisition of land here. And now I'm going to do my walk. I normally do it in the spring, but I'm going to do it on December 12th, I think, because that's the 250th anniversary of when George Washington made an offer. Not just made an offer, but closed the deal to purchase the land. He wouldn't close until well after the Revolution. That's another story. But he was at that point becoming a landowner in Arlington County. So also going on, which left a lasting legacy in Arlington County, is they were constructing Glebe House. So the what's now Christ Church, I guess they call it Christ Church then too, might have a different name, but the Church of England in Alexandria, the Glebe House for the pastor was, many of you know the history of Glebes. It's a farm which is provided to the Church of England minister in each parish. And that farm would provide, in addition to salary, that the primary salary for the support for the Church of England minister would be the glebe farm. So the parish, which is centered on Christ Church, but also with Falls Church, they both were same parish, were created, purchased some land in what's now Arlington, where the glebe house is, several hundred acres, and that house was under construction, the initial house. There's only a remnant of that 18th century house left. You can look and there's a foundation wall. The house is not open to the public, but there are photographs, and whenever they do tours, you can actually see the foundation wall of the 18th century house. Most of what you look at there is 19th century. So, but that house was under construction, and that becomes relevant for the rest of our story shortly after. Just immediately, this week, 250 years ago, they were having a lot of inclement weather, but it was also planting season for the wheat and the different thing the farmers were going to have, which is relevant for our story because a meeting was called on July 5th, 1774, so 250 years ago, a few days ago, for the people of Fairfax County to meet and to adopt resolutions in support of the city of Boston, which in opposition to the Intolerable Acts through Fairfax County. And we know that 63 people who lived in what is now Arlington County actually signed a petition which were objecting to the Intolerable Acts. And some of the people who signed that petition left a very good legacy here, like Moses Ball and Moses Ball Jr. and John Ball, who became Ensign John Ball during the Revolution, and Donaldson's and George Washington and George Mason and a bunch of other folks we're going to talk about. But we had already had one instance of Fairfax County, which included Arlington, pushing back against British rule. And they're meeting again, starting on July 5th and then postponed into July 18th to deal with the latest aggressions from the British government. And that started with actually action by the colonists in Boston with the Boston Tea Party. So in response to the Boston Tea Party, Parliament passed the Boston Port Act, which closed the Port of Boston. After the Port of Boston was closed, Sam Adams and the Boston Committee of Correspondence wrote a letter to all the other colonies asking for support for the government of Massachusetts and or the legislature of Massachusetts, not the royal governor, but the patriots in Massachusetts and the city of Boston because of the Boston Port Act. And while those letters were circulating from the Boston Committee of Correspondence, Parliament proceeded to pass several other acts. Intolerable acts included the Massachusetts Government Act, which essentially closed the Massachusetts government, the Quartering Act, which allowed the British military to take over anybody's house anytime they want, the Administration of Government Act, which, among other things, allowed the British government to try British soldiers. If they murdered anybody in the colonies, they could take them back to England for trial so they didn't have to face colonial juries. And then the Quebec Act, which in addition to abolishing trial by jury in the Quebec, extended the boundaries of Quebec province to include all of the western areas of the colonies, most of which were claimed by Virginia. And so basically, Virginians felt like the Quebec Act stole their land, gave it to Quebec, took away right to trial by jury in that area. So they had this whole bunch of grievances that were all occurring at this time. And in response to those grievances, the Virginia House of Burgesses, at the end of May, were meeting, just a regular session, and they received the letter from the Boston Committee of Correspondence explaining the Boston Port Act had closed the Port of Boston. And they decided, and they being a group of hotheads that included Patrick Henry, Thomas Jefferson, and Richard Henry Lee, a few other well-known names, decided to pass a resolution for a day of fasting and prayer. And it was interesting in that the day of fasting and prayer was not for the whole Commonwealth. It was really directed to the members, the Burgesses. They were all supposed to take that Sunday off, or June, I guess it was a Sunday, but June 1st, 1774, for fasting and prayer in response to these terrible acts by the British government. Well, when Governor Dunmore read the resolution for the day of fasting and prayer, he dissolved the Virginia Burgesses, the House of Burgesses. So the Virginia legislature, they had done this before. They didn't really care they were dissolved. They went and met at Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, and they decided to go ahead and pass some resolutions, even though they were not officially in session. And among those resolutions were all the members were supposed to go back to their counties and get a sense from the counties of what they felt about the British government actions, closing the port of Boston and the other actions the British were doing. That is the setting why on July 5th, the meeting was called in Fairfax County, and it was in Alexandria. Market Square today is where the courthouse stood for Fairfax County at that time. And that's where they met, postponed the meeting, and then rescheduled it for July 18th. So that's the setting where we am. Now I'm going to try to see if I can. Slide, I've got this really great photograph of the Fairfax Resolves. The interesting thing about the Fairfax Resolves is I didn't even try to read them. It's handwritten, very badly faded. Luckily, there's a lot of transcriptions out there. So I've read several times the transcriptions of the Fairfax Resolves. But one issue came up is that you read all the different reports about the Fairfax Resolves, and they talk about the signers of the Fairfax Resolves, the 25 signers of the Fairfax Resolves. But they also, the last clause, the last resolution, the last resolve in the Fairfax Resolves, there's 26 resolves, I think, in total. I have the number here. The last resolve names 25 people to a committee. So sometimes that's referred 26 separate resolutions in the Fairfax Resolves. The number 26 names 25 men, starting with George Washington, including George Mason and others, to a committee. They don't call it the Committee of Safety. They don't call it the Committee of Correspondence, but they basically call it the committee to implement the implement the resolutions. They not so much implement them, but to transmit the resolutions. And so that committee ends up becoming the government of Arlington County as rural government dissolves. But those 25 people were named as the committee that would end up running Arlington. And most of the reports describe them as the signers of the Fairfax Resolves. Well, I went back and looked at that handwritten part, and the one thing I can tell is it's all written by one hand. There's not multiple signatures at the end. So the 25 names at the end are all written by one person. So I don't think those are the signers. And what it says in the beginning of the Fairfax Resolves is at a meeting of the freeholders and inhabitants of Fairfax County, the following resolutions were adopted. So what really happened is it wasn't that 25 men who mostly were big landowners got together and reached a decision, but the people of Fairfax County that included people here in what's now Arlington came to a meeting, and then they elected 25 people to kind of lead things as their representatives. So a lot of people think when they look at and I've actually studied these resolutions, like the Fairfax Resolves, are not unique to Fairfax County and not unique to Arlington, obviously, but not unique to Fairfax County. As I was saying, the Virginia committee, in lieu of the House of Burgesses, asked every county in Virginia, and most did. There's some 30-some resolves were issued by various counties in Virginia. The first, and Fairfax Resolves were not the first. The first was actually in Fredericksburg. That guy, James Mercer, I was talking about, he was selling land to George Washington. He signed the very first resolves in Virginia, and that was on June 1st. So Fredericksburg started it. Prince William County beat Virginia beat Fairfax by over a month on June 6th. They passed some resolves also written by George Mason. And there were a number of resolutions that were passed again and ended up being 30-some by Virginia counties. And it wasn't just Virginia. Pat, my wife and I just went to Chestertown, Maryland, a couple months ago for the celebration of the Chestertown Tea Party, which is a lot of fun, probably fictional, but what is very real is that the Chestertown, the town of Chestertown, Maryland, passed resolutions exactly as Fairfax did. They weren't written the same way, but they opposed the intolerable acts. They imposed the closure of the Port of Boston. And it wasn't just Maryland, ended up in Pennsylvania, several towns had passed some. New York, I was reading the Orangetown resolutions recently in upstate New York, passing similar resolutions. Most of the towns in Boston, I mean, in outside of Boston, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, passed resolutions supporting the city of Boston, of course. Connecticut, I think there were some in Rhode Island. There was at least one in New Jersey, at least one in North Carolina. The Charleston, South Carolina did some. The only one I haven't seen is Georgia. I believe almost all the colonies ended up at the local level passing resolutions in support of the city of Boston that was essentially shut down. And it was not just shut down, it was embargoed. It was, it's the technical term, when you blockade. The British had a blockade on the port of Boston. They had the British Navy was parked in the harbor there so that no supplies could get in. So, that's what this resolution was. It was one of those, but it ended up being the Fairfax Resolves, out of all these hundreds of resolutions that were passed in all the colonies, ended up being the primary mover of subsequent events in the revolution. It came from right here in what was then Fairfax County, but included people who lived nearby here, who met and came up with this set of resolutions that ended up becoming instructions to the Virginia delegation that went to the first Continental Congress. The Virginia Convention began on August 1st. They ended up electing, I think it was on July 14th, is even before they adopted the resolves. They elected George Washington and a guy named Charles Broadwater, who owned land in Arlington, was one of the biggest landowners in what's now Arlington, was Charles Broadwater. So Broadwater and Washington were the two representatives to the Virginia Convention, and then they elected the delegates to the Continental Congress. And one of the Fairfax resolves stated that, do exactly that, send instructions to the Virginia Convention, elect delegates to go to Philadelphia to the Continental Congress, meet at the Continental Congress and come up with a non-importation agreement. What am I doing wrong? Stay over here?
Yeah, they can't see you.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. All right, I apologize to everybody online. I think I've lost most. Okay, where was I saying? So I could read from them, but I'm just talking off my head right now. But what the 26 resolutions did is they ended up stating a course of action that was followed by the Continental Congress and ended up leading to the next steps, which would be the battles of Lexington and Concord. The Fairfax Resolves don't say go shoot British soldiers when they come and try to capture your arms. So, but that was a result of the political actions that were being taken by the colonies, all of which were laid out in this most succinct form by this document, the Fairfax Resolves. So I'm going to pull up, and now I'm going to read some of this phrasing in there in the Fairfax Resolves, because you'll see the language ends up in the Declaration of Independence and ends up in repeated across many different actions by the colonists as they rebel against British rule. And those ideas, they weren't new to the Fairfax Resolves. Pretty much everything in the Fairfax Resolves was written by somebody else, but the compilation by George Mason in the Fairfax Resolves was the most succinct statement and the most succinct and comprehensive both statement of the reasons why the colonies were in revolt. And that's why it's generally cited as being either the most important local document or maybe on par with the Suffolk County Resolves, which is Boston Resolves, which came out of Massachusetts as a local government act, a local action, which was a precursor to the revolution. So let me pull the language up here and tell you some of the things that George Mason wrote that were adopted. And further, just the process. Again, the resolutions were kind of voted on by the committee, decided. George Mason was given the pen to write them up. He went home to Gunston Hall, wrote them up, took the drafts to Mount Vernon on July 17th and spent the night with George Washington at Mount Vernon. And both Georges, Washington and Mason, made some edits to the Fairfax Resolves and brought that very messy handwritten document to, and probably they rewrote it. So it probably wasn't messy. It got messy because it was amended some at the meeting. But the document I can't read today was in George Mason's hand. So here's some of the key resolves. The fundamental principle of the peoples being governed by no laws to which they have not given their consent, by representatives freely chosen by themselves. Yeah, that's the number 2 resolve. They start off by saying, oh, we're very loyal to King George. And by the way, after they get that out of the way, then they get to the heart of it. And the first thing they say is the fundamental principle is the peoples have to govern themselves. That's actually not very fundamental to history leading up to that point. It's actually very novel, but it's stated as an absolute certainty in the Fairfax Resolves. Resolve number 3, that let's see here. How do I scroll that over? Okay. The legislative power can be exercised only by provincial assemblies. So it was a rejection of rule by the British Parliament. There was a very novel statement that, well, all the other colonies were saying it too, so not novel, but it was not something that had been executed, that the colonies could govern themselves. Mason spent a lot of time actually trying to argue for historical precedents for what they were asserting. So I think it was kind of a stretch in history. I think what they were doing really was revolutionary, but he actually claimed these were ancient rights that they had as English citizens. But then he also made arguments that were more universal in nature and not some sort of inherited right. And what I tried to do in my PowerPoint, which you can't see, is focus on the universal statements that underlie the Fairfax Resolves. So the 5th resolve is talks about the privileges of free people and natural rights of mankind, that they were invoking natural rights. So this is not limited to just something that they have as Englishmen, that this is something that has universal appeal. And that sentiment, and of course, ended up going into the Declaration of Independence and then became a model for nations all around the world. The 6th resolve, taxation and representation. So you have to get into 6 resolves before taxation is mentioned in the Fairfax Resolves. So a lot of people like to think that the revolution started as a tax revolt. It was not about taxes. Matter of fact, as soon as it was all about representation, and as soon as the Patriots got in, they needed to raise money, but that was done by the people. That was not being taxation imposed upon them. So the 6th resolve, when they first mentioned taxation, it's in the context of taxation and representation are in their nature inseparable. The right of withholding or of giving and granting their own money is the only effectual security to a free people against the encroachments of despotism and tyranny. So the revolution is not about taxation, it's about creeping despotism and creeping tyranny and how the colonists wouldn't put up with it. 7th resolution, the powers over the people of America now claimed by the British House of Commons, in whose election we have no share. So basically, we didn't vote for these people. If continued, will establish the most grievous and intolerable species of tyranny and oppression that ever was inflicted upon mankind. Now, that's a lot of hyperbole, but you actually see that hyperbole all across the colonies. They took very seriously that they would end up as slaves. They would end up under tyranny if they did not stand up for their rights at this stage. All right, so 8th resolution. It is our greatest, this is they actually say this several times. I'm going to read one of them because it's ironic. Resolved that is our greatest wish and inclination, as well as interest, to continue our connection with and dependence upon the British government. But though we are its subjects, we will use every means which heaven hath given us to prevent our becoming its slaves. So they basically said we are subjects of the king, but we are not slaves to the king. And that statement, the first part was repeated in several places, but the real point they wanted to make is they were not going to agree to everything. Then they said the next one is premeditated design and system formed and pursued by the British ministry to introduce an arbitrary government into His Majesty's American colonies. That's what the British Parliament was up to, and that there's an intention in the American colonies it claimed that there was an intention in the American colonies to set the colonies up as independent states. Now, actually, at that time, all of the resolutions, all of the Patriot leaders insisted they were not looking for independence. Maybe Sam Adams was, but pretty much true, I think, of all the Virginia Patriots. Nobody was quite ready for independence. They would be within a year, but at that time they weren't. I think they were sincere about that, but they were certainly not going to put up with parliamentary rule. And they made it pretty clear if the king didn't agree with them, they were actually going to put up with the king. So independence was, I think, pretty clearly in the offing, but they were all repeated that was not their goal. All right, the 10th resolution, 10th resolved, it reiterates each of the intolerable acts. It complains about raising, or starting with the T Act and the Townsend Acts. It complains about raising a revenue without their consent, taking away trial by juries, vengeance upon the town of Boston, which is the Boston Port Act, encouragement of murderers in the province of Massachusetts, which was the Massachusetts Government Act, which was it the Administration of Government Act, which allowed anybody who any British soldier who killed somebody in Massachusetts to be tried back in Britain. Okay, we'll skip that. I'm going to jump on to one which is very interesting. I want to read. So resolution 17 is, I'm just going to read it. Resolved, that is the opinion of this meeting, that during our present difficulties and distress, no slaves ought to be imported in any of the British colonies on this continent, and we take this opportunity of declaring our most earnest wishes to see an entire stop forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. So George Mason wrote this. George Mason was a slaveholder. George Washington helped write this. George Washington was a slaveholder. And most of the Patriot leaders, at least in Virginia, were slaveholders. But you actually see the sentiment pretty clear. I think they sincerely, at least at that time, intended on the abolishment of slavery at some point. And that was right from the onset of the revolution. Now that went away, and but as a founding principle of the revolution, there's a lot of discussion about whether the country was founded upon slavery. If you read the words of the founding fathers, that was not one of their principles. That was not their goal. At some point they lost track of that goal. It certainly didn't. It took a civil war to actually implement it. But there was a lot of encouraging signs that the independence movement would include independence for slaves. And it's sad that that didn't come to fruition. All right, I could keep reading these resolutions, but what I instead suggest is it's an easy read. Go Google Fairfax Resolves and read them and see just how much those statements ended up having a profound impact on America. And again, some of the people who met at the courthouse in Alexandria, who voted for these resolutions, lived in what's now Arlington. One of the people who was named to the committee, one of the Alexanders, I think it was, forget which Alexander it was, one of the Alexanders lived in Arlington. And several of the people who are named on the committee own property in Arlington. So let me go tell you who was there. So the committee had named 25 men. We already talked about George Washington and George Mason. Charles Broadwater, who I already mentioned, ended up being a delegate during the rest of the Revolution. He would be a colonel in the Fairfax militia. One of the members of the Fairfax committee was a man named John West, who owned some property in Arlington, was very prominent in Alexandria. John West was a former Burgess, had actually been Burgess in the previous session of Virginia House of Burgesses, but would die soon thereafter. But he started out initially in the Fairfax committee. John Carlisle, if you haven't been to the Carlisle House in Alexandria, I highly recommend it. John Carlisle owned property in what's now Arlington. He and his partner, John Dalton, both actually jointly owned property. And both Carlisle and Dalton had a very huge role in the Revolution in Alexandria in supplying the Continental Army, setting up hospitals there was a smallpox hospital in Alexandria during the Revolution, where the Continental Army actually, a number of the Continental Army soldiers were actually inoculated along with the population in Alexandria. That was set up through Carlisle and Dalton and some Continental officers. Both John Carlisle and John Dalton had a small amount of property up by Pimmet, I think it was up by Pimmet Run. John Carlisle had a lot of property down at Shirlington too. John West, John Carlisle, John Dalton all died during the Revolution. Dalton died, I think, in 1777. John Carlisle died right at the end of the Revolution. And it's very poignant. He set his son, his 15-year-old son, off to join the Continental Army as a cadet George William Carlisle. And 15-year-old cadet George William Carlisle got killed at the Battle of Utah Springs in South Carolina in 1781, right at the end of the Revolution. So, and then Carlisle died, John Carlisle himself died soon after. So these men had made some great sacrifices for the cause. And they knew Arlington. They didn't just travel through this area. They lived and worked here, even if they didn't sleep here. John Dalton was also interesting that he and George Mason, I skipped over George Mason. I highly recommend Gunston Hall as some place to get the full story of George Mason. You can find out about the Fairfax Resolves there. As a matter of fact, next weekend and the following weekend, there are seminars at Gunston Hall and in Mount Vernon for the Fairfax Resolves, focusing on by some real historians, not just amateur historian like me, talking about the impacts of the Fairfax Resolves. And I recommend, I'm going to be out of town, so I'll miss one of them, but I'm going to catch the second one. But I do recommend those. But that was John Dalton. Dalton and George Mason ended up forming the government of Fairfax County in Alexandria was really run by George Mason and John Dalton to some extent, including setting up a Navy. We had a Navy in Fairfax County in Alexandria. They put together 3 ships because the British had some ships that were raiding up the Potomac, and there was a concern they needed some ships to defend Alexandria. So they actually outfitted a Navy. There were some Marines, probably some of the people. Matter of fact, one person we know who lived in what's now Arlington started out his career before he joined the Continental Army as a Marine on board the Alexandrian Navy. So there, and the Alexandrian Navy actually had one engagement with the British, some British ships in 1781, towards the end of the Revolution. So Alexandria formed its militia. There was a Fairfax Independent Company whose commander was George Washington. George Washington drilled the Fairfax Independent Company, which would have included people who lived here. We don't know their names. The rosters have all been destroyed. So you can see scattered references to who served in the militia, but the militia roles aren't available anymore. But folks from here served in first the Fairfax Independent Company, which was entirely a work of George Mason and this Fairfax Committee. It was not something that was put together at the direction of Williamsburg or at the direction of the other patriots. Now, by 1775, the Fairfax Independent, what do they call it? I mentioned earlier. Anyway, it got replaced by regular militia roles. So it got converted. So in the militia were organized at the county level, but under state direction. So the Virginia Convention, which took over from the Virginia House of Burgesses, one of the first things they did was organize a militia law so that all of the counties were putting together first militia and then raising Continental Army regiments. So 3 different Virginia Continental Army regiments had troops raised from what's now Arlington. Starting out, there was 1 company in the 2nd Virginia. I think George Johnston was the commander. He didn't live here, but so there was starting out with 1 company in 2nd Virginia. Then the 3rd Virginia regiment had a Fairfax company, maybe a couple of companies from Fairfax County. And then eventually a 10th Virginia regiment was also recruited out of Fairfax County. So 3 different Continental Army regiments had recruited here in Arlington. Now there's a couple of graves of Continental soldiers in Arlington County. John Redden and Ensign John Ball both say they were in the 6th Virginia. I think that's probably because the 6th Virginia was actually recruited out in Western Virginia. In my PowerPoint, which I'm not showing you, I've got a nice photo of a nice drawing of the 6th Virginia in these buckskin uniforms. It's actually not historically accurate because the original 6th Virginia at one point got disbanded, probably because they were captured at Charleston when the Virginia Continental Line was wiped out, 1780. And the remnants of the 6th Virginia were reorganized as the remnants of the 10th Virginia. The 10th, let me back up, 6th Virginia stayed out west. So it really was never here in Arlington County. But after the Continental Line got wiped out in 1780, they renumbered all the regiments. So what had been the 10th Virginia Regiment got renumbered as the 6th Virginia Regiment. And my guess is that John Redden and John Ball, who both on their graves say they were 6th Virginia, started out 10th Virginia, got reorganized into what became the 6th Virginia. I'm going to mention some other names of people from Arlington County, starting with them. I am not, and that or somebody who's time me because I have no idea what time it is. So, okay, so I got half hour. Okay. And again, if anybody has any questions, I'd much rather answer questions than drone on, but I'm capable of droning for a half hour. I mentioned John Dalton. Philip Alexander. Philip Alexander was the one member who was of the Fairfax Committee who actually lived in what is now Arlington. That property ended up being sold later to somebody named John Parke Custis, who is more well known as being the stepson of George Washington. And John Parke Custis served in the Revolution. He served in the Revolution first as a member of the House of Burgesses, rather ineffective member of the House of Burgesses, but he did serve. And then he volunteered in 1781 to go to Yorktown and serve as an aide-de-camp to his stepfather. So John Parke Custis rode by himself, left what's now Arlington County, his home at Abingdon Plantation, which is National Airport, and went to Yorktown to serve with George Washington. And during the siege, he contacted cabin fever, I forget what they called it, one of the different 18th century names of illnesses, and died. So John Parke Custis, George Washington's stepson, died in service of the Continental Army. And he is one of our heroes from Arlington County. And you can visit. I highly encourage next time you go to National Airport, if you haven't been there, between parking lots A and B, there's a really great preservation of the ruins of Abingdon Plantation and some nice explanation, including within the old terminal of the airport of National Airport. There's some nice display cases which talk the 20th century history of the National Airport, but also the 18th century history, the 19th century history of Abingdon Plantation. Charles Alexander also owned property, and Philip Alexander's brother. There's a guy named Townsend Dade who's very interesting. He was actually the rector of Christ Church. He was the Church of England minister who signed, well, nobody signed, who was named on the committee to do the Fairfax Resolves. So many of the Anglican ministers stayed loyalists, but not Townsend Dade. On the other hand, he apparently was a pretty lousy minister. So they were building the Glebe House for him. He would move into the Glebe House by 1775, I think, is when he moved into the Glebe House. And so he actually ended up living, at that point, he was not living in Arlington County, but he would then live for a while in what is now Arlington County at the Glebe House. But then they had some sort of beef with him and they fired him. So they went to go replace him with another minister, and who they ended up recruiting was a very confirmed patriot, a guy named David Griffith, who was from Loudoun County, I believe, and was also both a surgeon and a chaplain for the Continental Army, and had served from 1776 through 1778, I think. Might have those years wrong. But anyway, he served for several years in the Continental Army, including at Valley Forge and at Brandywine, and I don't know if he's at Monmouth, but he was at several, he was at both Germantown and Brandywine. And David Griffith resigned from the Continental Army, though, to take the charge of the Fairfax Parish. And he then moved into the Glebe House. So one of the patriots had heroic service in the Revolution. David Griffith was living right here in the Glebe House during the end of the Revolution, when the French and American armies were marching through Arlington County, marching right down Glebe Road. There was a cattle drive down Glebe Road right in front of David Griffith's house at the Glebe House. There are some receipts somewhere, although I've been looking for them for the last couple of years. I can't find them. So if anybody knows where they are, I've seen receipts where David Griffith had sold some supplies to the Continental Army. So from his Glebe farm, he was helping feed the army. Got paid for it, but basically, actually, the French, their money was worth something. So the American currency was pretty worthless. It was mostly IOUs when you sold stuff to the American army. But so I mentioned Townsend Day, and then finally there was a guy named Henry Gunnell, who at one point lived in Arlington, and he ended up being sheriff of Fairfax County at the end of the Revolution. So he didn't serve in the Continental Army, but he was serving in that capacity. So these are I think it's 10 or so of the 25 members of the Fairfax Committee were actually connected to us. They didn't live here, they had lived here at some point, or they own property here. Now, let's talk about some other service. I've actually gone through a bunch of different records to try to identify service members from what's now Arlington County. I mentioned a few already, including Ensign John Ball, but he had two other brothers who there's some indication that they also served. One is referenced as being Lieutenant James Ball. The other one, George Ball, is referenced as having served without a rank. I would assume he was a private. I haven't really seen any confirmation of that, but there are at least references in the genealogies for the Ball family that both of those served along with their brother. But I would note that these are sons of Moses Ball, and if you have been on my walk of George Washington's Forest, we go by the Moses Ball Spring. We see the plantation, the farm that Moses Ball owned. But Moses Ball was one of those guys who signed the petition in 1770 that George Washington was circulating against the British government. And my guess is he showed up with his sons, he and his son signed, and my guess is they showed up at the Fairfax courthouse to adopt the Fairfax Resolves. And certainly Ensign John Ball is documented as having served in the Revolution. There's very clear documentation of that, and they knew George Washington. So these are all Arlington folks. I mentioned Private John Redden, who nobody really knows. He supposedly came from England, not born within the colonies, but nobody knows where he enlisted. But he very well could, but he did die and lived in Arlington County after the war. And in the regiment he was in, if it started out as the 10th, he very well could have come from this area. I mentioned David Griffith. I mentioned John Parke Custis. Charles Broadwater's son, Lieutenant Charles Lewis Broadwater, served in both the 10th Virginia and also in the Alexandria Navy. So that's some service records. There was a Colonel William Adams from Fairfax Militia, lived within Arlington. I think his son was Private Simon Adams, ended up joining the 10th Virginia. One of the Alexanders, George Dent Alexander, served as a surgeon for the Virginia Continental Line. There are supposedly a couple Arlingtonians whose family trees indicate they served in the Revolution. Captain David Orrell and his brother Captain Samuel Orrell, one with the Virginia Continentals, the other with Fairfax Militia. There, Captain John West Jr., who's John West's nephew and not his son, was in the 10th Virginia. I think he may have Arlington connection, although I couldn't pin that down. There were Pearsons that were prominent in Arlington County after the war. There are references to Captain Simon Pearson and Captain Thomas Pearson. Those post-war ranks are always a little suspicious. People tend to promote themselves after the war. So you want to see contemporaneous documentation of anybody's rank before you take it seriously, but at least they were referenced that way after the war. Somebody who we know served was Colonel George Minor. We actually have a historical mark in Arlington on Miners Hill up in far northern part of the county. George Minor's house was actually right in McLean, right across the Fairfax County line, but he owned the hill there, and that was his property right in Arlington. Colonel Ludwell Lee was only a colonel after the Revolution, but because he was a very young man during the Revolution, but he had a very famous father, Richard Henry Lee, but he also ended up owning the warehouses at the mouth of Pemmott Run. So he owned property right here in Arlington. He served in the Virginia Militia Cavalry. They went to Yorktown and fought the siege of Yorktown and fought some battles down there. So as a young man, he enlisted in that, and after the war, he rose to the rank of colonel. One of the Burke and Herbert Bank, one of the Herbert family, Thomas Herbert, apparently lived in this part of Fairfax County. He was captured during the Revolution and spent many years in prison. And one of his relatives were trying to get George Washington to intercede to get him released, and eventually had that happen. I mentioned James Mercer. James Mercer started out, in 1774, he owned land, and then he sold it to George Washington. But I mentioned his very prominent role as a patriot. And then George Washington's brother, Charles Washington, owned property here in Arlington. He was up in far north Arlington. He owned some property. He actually lived down in Fredericksburg. And interestingly enough, even though George Washington was responsible for Fairfax Resolves, Charles Washington signed resolutions before his brother did. So the Fredericksburg resolutions, which are the first resolutions in Virginia on June 1st, were signed by Charles Washington. He was one of the leaders in that, as was James Mercer, who I also mentioned. And then he subsequently signed the Spotsylvania County and one other county's resolutions because he had property in multiple places. So Washington's brother was also a patriot, even though he did not serve in the military. All right, so at this point, I've kind of reached through everything I wanted to go through. No, actually, I was going to talk a little bit about chronology. Let me pull the chronology up. I was talking about people. One of my slides talks about timing of events. Let me see if I can find it. Well, luckily, oh yeah, I found it. Okay. So what happened in Arlington besides people going off to war? A lot of the war passed through Arlington. Really, that's the best we can say, other than camping. I guess that's still passing through. But the main route north and south during the Revolution was the King's Highway, and it went through Arlington County. One of my slides is a 18th century map of Arlington. I was going to point out the roads. I was going to point out, if you drive down Army-Navy Drive today, that short little stretch of Army-Navy Drive is very appropriately named because the Continental Army, in addition to the Army in World War II coming from the Pentagon, you've had a lot in the Union Army during the Civil War. There's a lot of marching has occurred on Army-Navy Drive because that has been the highway, the north-south highway, the King's Highway at that time is what they called it at the start of the Revolution, and continued calling it after the Revolution. Went right through there. And it crossed 4 Mile Run where the bridge goes across into Delray now. That's where the crossing was for the highway. It went on down through the middle of Old Town Alexandria. But going north from Army Navy Drive, it went through the middle of what is now Arlington Cemetery. If you go, my wife and I just went to a funeral for her cousin a couple of weeks ago at Arlington Cemetery. We were driving down Eisenhower Drive, and that is the King's Highway. Eisenhower Drive is built over the King's Highway. So next time you visit Arlington Cemetery, you're traveling footsteps that military have been traveling on for 250 years. One thought I always have is that, well, let's talk about the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route. In 1781, the French and American armies marched from Rhode Island and New York to Yorktown, Virginia. And it's called a march, but most of the troops actually went by ship. They loaded on the boats at Elkton or at Annapolis or at Baltimore, and went by ship to get to Yorktown, landed at Jamestown, then marched a few miles to Yorktown. But the wagon train, the cattle drive, there was all the troops had to be fed with beef, and the cavalry and miscellaneous other folks, including officers like George Washington and General Rochambeau, didn't go by ship. They rode on fast horses to get to Yorktown. And they came down what has been designated as the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route. It's a National Historic Trail. Annette mentioned that in introducing to me, and I've been involved in this for 20 years. It seems a long time before it was even designated. But we have a stretch of it here in Arlington County. And what that stretch is the wagon trains and the cavalry, when they crossed the Potomac River, they crossed at what is now T Bridge, was a ferry. There was no bridge across the Potomac then. There was a ferry there from Georgetown to what's now Roslyn. And they got on the King's Highway there and went south. So the King's Highway there, if you ever go into Roslyn, you may notice that the road which is closest to the water, the lowest road in Roslyn is called Ridge Road, which makes you scratch your head, because why would you have, when there is a ridge in Roslyn, but it's several blocks away, why is Ridge Road the road which is the lowest point? Well, it's because that Ridge Road, before they built Arlington Cemetery and before they built 395, before they built the Shirley Highway, was a straight line that went from that 2 blocks in Roslyn through Arlington Cemetery to what is now Ridge Road in South Arlington. So that was one continuous road from South Ridge Road to Ridge Road in Roslyn today, but it's been all broken up. But that Ridge Road was in the 18th century called King's Highway. So the troops got there, and when they were crossing, when the French wagon train was crossing the Potomac, one of the boats capsized and one man and some horses drowned. And I like to think, it may not be true, but what I always like to think is that when that man's body washed up, they buried him along the side of the road in what is now Arlington Cemetery. It's a natural place to bury him. That's, one of the first things you get to on the march is that stretch of the road. And it's, just pure fancy on my part, but it is appropriate way to think about honoring those folks. You can see some actual Revolutionary War veterans, Pierre Lafont and some others are buried in Arlington Cemetery. You can see their graves. Arlington Cemetery, of course, were not the original burial grounds because it only got started during the Civil War, but there were some Revolutionary War soldiers reinterred, buried in the cemetery. I end my presentation by talking about, I talk about all the marches to and fro through Arlington County, and there were a bunch of troop movements, some going north, some going south. But I also try to go through, and I can pull the slide up and just walk through what you can see today. I've mentioned some already. I don't need to pull a slide. I know what they are. I mentioned Arlington Cemetery. I mentioned Abingdon Plantation. Abingdon Plantation, the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Route is actually going to use the GW Parkway instead of trying to follow the completely broken up Ridge Road, which is not drivable. You can't drive through Eisenhower Drive, for instance. Instead of doing that, they're just going to use George Washington Memorial Parkway to get them out running, which is on the route. But that luckily goes right by Abingdon Plantation, which is a very important stop because, again, one of the people who served there lived in that house. and that's one of the sites we have here in Arlington. My favorite site in Arlington, and Annette mentioned this as well, is the John Ball Cabin. There's no indication that any of the Revolutionary War soldiers went there, except for we know that there's no way that Ensign John Ball, growing up next door, did not go there. And if some of his brothers actually served, they would have gone there too. But there's no documentation of other Revolutionary War soldiers visiting there, but they probably did. But what is important is that house is one of the few extant normal people's houses that you can see from the Revolution. The mansion, you can find the mansions. You can find Gunston Halls, and you can find Mount Vernon's. You can't find as much history as you have in those two, but you can find comparable architecture. The mansions get preserved, but the normal people's houses don't get preserved. And we're very, very lucky here in Arlington that you can see the typical house that most farmers lived in when the troops were marching around during the Revolution. What they would march past, or the houses they came from when they served in the Revolution, would be houses like the John Ball Cabin. And we have those preserved here in the county, and through the great work that Mark and Annette, and most especially Annette, because I chaired the Ball Sellers House Committee for 3 years, and I was so glad to relinquish the reins to Annette, because she's done a fabulous job with it. And if you haven't visited that, that is a very important resource for us that I highly recommend. I should also mention there's a couple of cemeteries. The Southern Shreve Cemetery, you can see that's where Ensign John, that's where Private John Redden is buried. And you can also see the Ball Family Cemetery, I think it's called, where Ensign John Ball is buried. And we have Arlington historical markers there for those sites. Can pull up my slide and tell you if I'm omitting anything else, but those are the key sites we actually have here in Arlington. But go next door to Alexandria, see what we have here in Arlington, but also go next door to Alexandria, to Old Town, see Christ Church, see Old Presbyterian Meeting House, look at the historical markers here, see the reconstruction of George Washington's townhome, and make sure you go to Mount Vernon and you go to Gunston Hall. That's where you can get the full story in addition to what we have here. Keeping in mind that their story is our story, because in 1774 and in 1775 and all through the Revolution, we were part of Fairfax County, an integral part of what these men, famous men, did to achieve American independence. Started right here in Arlington County. I, lost track of all my slides, obviously, but that's pretty much my presentation. But I've been rambling, and I'm happy to entertain any questions. Yes, sir.
Just you mentioned, you said a lot during your talk, what is now Arlington County. When it was part of Fairfax County, were there some specific landmarks or communities within Arlington County?
Not really. I mean, Fairfax County was pretty undifferentiated besides the town of Alexandria. I mean, obviously, we're on the east side of the county. So if somebody at that point was talking about the folks who live on the east side of the county, they'd be talking about what's now Arlington. But other than this, that simple geographic direction, the only other difference is having waterfront is a very different land holding than the interior holdings. But most of Arlington's actually interior. The waterfront's only a few of the plantations. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question that's a little long point, but you mentioned Glebe House repeatedly, and you talked about it being on Glebe Road somewhere around 1617. This county has 2 Glebe roads, and I've never quite understood why it has a north-south Glebe and an east-west Glebe that intersect down about where Glebe Road hits 395.
I think that's Alexandria's fault.
Is that because it changes? The county ends and they use the same name in Alexandria, or repeat the question?
There's when you cross 4 Mile Run, you get that East Glebe, and there's actually two Glebe roads there. But I think that all occurs across 4 Mile Run in Alexandria.
It's on the other side of 395.
Yeah.
It happens right there.
Yeah, but I actually don't know the history why that designation. The Glebe Road is a colonial road. So that alignment has been crossing 4 Mile Run there, not exactly at that point, but close to that point. But it used to just go straight into the Christ Church. So the Alexandria alignment of Glebe Road has all been kind of a modern adaptation of because it was just a straight line. It was literally the road that went from Christ Church in Old Town to the Glebe Farm is what the Glebe Road was. It forks at a couple of places and picked up some other roads. So there's some crooks and bends to it. The historic roads in Arlington, in addition to those segments of the Kings Highway that are left, that I mentioned, are Wilson Boulevard. Wilson Boulevard was the road to Auberry's Ferry. I think is what they called it. May have already changed it to a different name by then, but there was a road to the ferry, but it existed in the Revolution. Little Falls Road in North Arlington was a historic, that was actually a tobacco rolling road. It would roll because you had the warehouses on the mouth of Pemmant Run that's how you would access them down Little Falls Road. So those are historic roads. And then it's not in Arlington, but the Route 7, the Leesburg Pike, and Seminary Road. Then when Seminary Road splits off from Leesburg Pike, the historic road is Seminary Road and not Leesburg Pike. But that road dates from colonial era. That was the road. If you were going to Leesburg, it was called the Leesburg Road. If you're going to Alexandria, it was the Alexandria Road. But that was the road between Alexandria and Leesburg. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You touched on some of the similarities between the Virginia Declaration of Rights that Mason wrote and then the Declaration of Independence. Were Jefferson and Mason correspondence, or is there evidence of how Mason may have influenced Jefferson's drafting?
Jefferson and Mason certainly knew each other. Jefferson had a tremendous amount of respect for Mason. He read all of Mason's stuff, so there's no question they influenced each other. I don't think Jefferson would even pretend otherwise. Both actually quite eloquent. So, but it's a good, and neither one of those originated those thoughts. They basically took thoughts that were circulating, maybe back to John Locke and other stuff, but they encapsulated that thought in workable documents that created American independence and created our rights today. Okay.
So, do we have any questions?
Like about the some of the lost records of the soldiers and so forth, militiamen. So, what is there anything different you'd like to know? You're still kind of searching for, you trying to figure out that era?
There's a lot of things. One of the things I'm trying to research is where did people cross the Potomac? Because we know where the French and American wagon train crossed. I know there are references in some of the historical records to people crossing at the Georgetown Ferry. That meant they went from exactly where Key Bridge is today. That's where they crossed. But there were other ways to cross the Potomac. George Washington had his own private ferry. He would there was a spot along the GW Parkway where he owned, it was his property, and he had a tenant who ran a ferry for Washington. Washington usually crossed the Potomac there. There were ferries that went from downtown Alexandria across to well, it wasn't a district then, across to Maryland on that side. So everything didn't cross at Key Bridge. But if you had wagons, my guess those were more like boats. You could certainly put a horse on, but my guess is if you had a bunch of wagons, if you had anything heavy, you were crossing at the main ferry on the Kings Highway, which was into Arlington. So we know the wagon trains crossed there. There are some other references to like a Maryland regiment I know crossed there. But when you read about the different folks who went to the Continental Congress, they, folks, after the war started, you didn't take ships because the British controlled the sea. You actually rode north, and the main highway was crossing right there. So I'm curious how many of our founding fathers and famous folks like Lafayette, when he landed in South Carolina and then went to join the Continental Army, did he cross at the Georgetown Ferry? I'd like to research that issue because we need to mark that. We need to do as part of the Washington Rochambeau Revolutionary Round and just preserving Arlington's history, say this is the crossing point for all these very important historical incidents that passed through at this spot. Yes, sir, you had a hand up before.
Yes, you mentioned earlier how most of the church being church was this time. I'm curious how much of the general population in Arlington County was
So the question is, how much of the Virginia population was loyalists versus patriots or versus neutral? John Adams famously said that 1/3 of the colonists were patriots, 1/3 were loyalists, and 1/3 just wanted to stay out of it. A lot of people cite that. I actually don't see that in the records I see. What I see is maybe just a very, very vocal patriot force, but I mean, I've been looking at county resolutions all along the colonies, and these meetings are coming out unanimous time and time again, where nobody is speaking up against opposition to the British crown. And now, partly that was maybe the loyalists were cowed. We do know that some people would complain about it afterwards, but they wouldn't speak up in the meetings. But you find very little counter petitions that are occurring at this time. Where there are a few, like in Massachusetts, there were a couple towns that got lots of trouble because instead of supporting Boston, they were basically saying it's your fault, you ought to pay for the tea. And but they were persona non grata for the rest of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and that was partly going on. And you do read there was a very prominent, the best diary of Alexandria in the Revolution is by a loyalist, a guy named Philip Cresswell, who's a Brit who got stuck in the colonies for the first 3 years of the Revolution, and he wrote all these very sarcastic things, but he recorded all these events. So the best descriptions we have of the drilling of the Fairfax militia is the sarcastic commentary that Cresswell wrote about how they had such sloppy uniforms, they didn't have guns, and they were parading around with broomsticks because they didn't have guns. And he was making fun of them, but he actually recorded some important events, like everybody assumes that all the colonists had guns. They didn't have guns. The militia showed up. They had half the time they couldn't go into battle because they didn't have guns. So there were plenty of guns in the colonists, but people were not uniformly armed back then, as you might think. We weren't frontier here. Frontier had moved way out west past the Shenandoah at least a generation before, a couple generations before the Revolution. So these folks didn't really need guns for protection against Native Americans or for hunting. So deer were all hunted out already. So this was not people had guns, but it wasn't every farm had, multiple guns. Yes, sir.
Would you recommend for online resources or actual books that then want to do research on revolutionary?
So we're going to do. The question is, what would you recommend for online resources? I actually have a bibliography in my PowerPoint presentation, which will get posted after this. And I actually didn't finish it. I ran out of time because I waited, procrastinated. Yeah. But I will beef that up with some other resources, not just the sources I cite in my PowerPoint presentation, but some other resources, because there are some great books. There was one by a person named C.B. Rose. I didn't realize C.B. Rose was a woman until this recently. But C.B. Rose wrote a great book on the history of Arlington, which is probably the best source for what happened here during the Revolution that I can recommend. Other questions?
You did a fabulous job without electronics.